think we might have technical difficulties on this end, Pete. All right. Yeah, so like Marguerite said, thanks a lot for coming out in the summer on a Monday morning at 9 a.m. This was largely so Pete could join us, it being 9 p.m. his time. This works out pretty well. So today I'm going to present some of the findings from my dissertation research called Rough Seas Ahead, Navigating the Future Inequalities of Sea Level Rise. The Inequalities of Future Sea Level Rise. So this work was funded by National Science Foundation, ICON PhD program, UGA's Graduate School, and UGA's Center for Research and Engagement and Diversity, also here on campus. Now for those of you who are unfamiliar with coastal Georgia or tidal marshes more generally, this image on the screen is of about 6 miles of tidal salt marsh that exists between the mainland in McIntosh County and the southern end of Sapelo Island there under the yellow arrow. The daily rhythm of all human and non-human life on Georgia's coast is defined by the large tidal ebb and flow, having tides with a range of 2+ meters that move in and out twice daily. It's not uncommon for tourists to think that we're in a drought on the Georgia coast if they arrive at low tide, as the creeks look like mud sloughs that have only traces of the millions of gallons of water that was there just a few hours before. The rising sea is disrupting this daily rhythm, though, flooding roads, homes, and marshes, and transforming coastal life. This image shows the high tide event from last October flooding US Highway 80, which runs from Savannah, Georgia, out to Tybee Island. The tide this day was one of the highest ever recorded at the Fort Pulaski tide gauge located under the yellow arrow there, which is located on the Savannah River. These two images, taken by my friend and colleague Don Tree Smith, are from the ferry landing called Marsh Landing on Sapelo Island, again on the Georgia coast. As seas continue rising, floods such as these are going to become incredibly common, disrupting life on a much more regular basis than the once or twice, the 1 or 2 times that this is happening now. So for an overview of the talk I'm going to give today, I'll first show why studies of vulnerability to sea level rise are important and why we need more of them. And then I'll share my theoretical framework and research design. And next I'll zoom into the region of the US Georgia coast and show some of the results for projecting populations at risk to sea level rise. And then I'll present an analysis of race in the context of a comparative case study of 2 barrier island communities, those of Tybee and Sapelo, before moving to a reflective meta-analysis of each approach's ability to examine inequality and vulnerability to sea level rise. And lastly, I'll offer some concluding thoughts on my research. To situate the broader importance of studies on vulnerability to sea level rise, projections of sea level rise by the end of this century vary from less than 1 meter to as much as 2 meters. The black line in the graph shows the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change forecast, IPCC forecast, of about 1 meter by the year 2100. However, it's also critical to think about our commitment to sea level rise. And by commitment, I mean how much sea level rise we've signed up for at this point, but that would occur over many centuries due to the delayed response between greenhouse gas emissions and subsequent sea level rise. We can think about this analogously to a wind-up clock. As we wind the clock and we load tension into the spring of the clock, that tension is slowly released as the hand's winding around the clock. As we pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we load the atmosphere with the potential for sea level rise to occur over many centuries. So what we see in this figure is that Earth's committed sea level rise, the blue and orange lines representing 2 different IPCC scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions and their effect on multi-millennial sea level rise, is growing much faster than observed and predicted rates of transient sea level rise. The key points here are that as of 1995, indicated by the black arrow, Earth was already committed to 1 meter of sea level rise and will potentially reach this height or more by the year 2100. This suggests that it's not a question of if, but when the Earth will reach 1+ meters above pre-industrial global sea level. Very broadly then, my research investigates inequality and vulnerability to sea level rise, and I take an integrative approach by applying mixed methods, even epistemologies over multiple scales. While not all of them, the majority of studies on sea level rise vulnerability, especially in Georgia, have taken a rather quantitative approach, looking at what property would be flooded and how many people might be affected and the associated economic costs of that. This is, of course, valuable information to have, yet there's a large body of social theory, much of it in human geography, on nature-society relations that highlights the importance of socio-political processes as they affect power and inequality, access to resources, and the potential for harm to bodies, livelihoods, and places. So my work is influenced by theory and methods from quantitative fields such as geographic information science and demography, but as a human geographer, also by what Paul Robbins has called the community of practice of political ecology. My work also draws on Omi and Winon's contributions to critical race theory on colorblind and structural racisms. And I'll elaborate on what I mean by these later in the talk. Megan Cope and Sarah Elwood's work in Qualitative GIS, the central book here, helps to conceptually entangle these divergent approaches. I'll define what I mean by qualitative GIS momentarily, but I first want to focus on what I mean by vulnerability and risk. Vulnerability has been defined in many ways by many scholars, but as Casperson et al. Have said, searching for the right theory or model is reminiscent of the prolonged, sterile debate over the right political model of community politics until it finally dawned that there was in fact no single correct model. As an integrative dissertation project, the definitions that I use for vulnerability, sometimes defined as risk, move. These definitions move from risk being defined simply as the loss of land to rising seas through physical exposure, to risk as the product of social vulnerability and physical exposure, to vulnerability as an entangled social ecological process. I define social ecological vulnerability as a potentializing for harm, which is not, I argue, a state of being, but rather a multidimensional process of becoming, via continuously changing and entangled social ecological conditions within spaces of global assemblage. To capture the potential from this broad range of definitions for vulnerability and risk, I designed my research around two prior conceptualizations of vulnerability by others, as either outcome vulnerability or contextual vulnerability. The major points of difference in these approaches include outcome vulnerability typically being more of an objectivist epistemology that uses quantitative models and broader scale empirics to examine the patterns and impacts associated with vulnerability. And by epistemology, I simply mean a way of knowing something. In contrast to that, contextual vulnerability studies are more commonly social construction oriented in their epistemological framing. These types of investigations are normally based on finer scale case studies that are most concerned with interrogating the social processes that lead to uneven vulnerability across social difference. These types of studies often ask questions related to social justice as well. Each of these approaches to investigating vulnerability has limitations. I argue that quantitative modeling, which assesses outcome vulnerability, falls short on at least 4 fronts. First, such models disembody or unsituate social characteristics from their place-based power relations, which I contend are essential to understanding the production of social ecological vulnerability. Second, they separate social and biophysical domains at the point of analysis, thereby foreclosing on the possibility of a co-produced social ecological vulnerability. Third, due to challenges of weighting the model variables, they place diverse indicators of social vulnerability on level playing fields, often suggesting that being an elderly person is akin to being a racial minority and or impoverished with limited education. And fourth, they struggle to effectively represent the complexity and multiplicity of the social ecological landscape, often relying on two-dimensional cartographic representations. Though this last point, new innovative techniques in the field of geography have started to transform this limitation of 2D cartographic representation. On the other hand, qualitative contextual investigations have their own set of limitations as well. They have limited predictive power for analyzing future conditions, such as under a gradually changing climate with sea level rise. And as Trevor Birkenholtz has contended, such studies have relatively limited replicability as well, as results that are harder to generalize to broader areas when these are compared to outcome studies' ability to generalize results. And contextual studies are not as effective at informing or influencing hazards policy, in this case regarding adaptation planning or vulnerability mitigation. So then to apply a mixed methods plural epistemology research design framework, I used qualitative GIS, as it is both critical and self-reflective, combining the technology and methodology of the GIS's capabilities of spatial data analysis and visualization of geographic information with the rich descriptive contextual detail and interpretive analysis of qualitative research, such as ethnographic modes of inquiry. I argue that it makes possible the bridging of often incommensurate literatures and methods of practice for investigating complex processes and outcomes. For example, those that are associated with the formation and impacts of vulnerability to sea level rise. Specifically, I used qualitative GIS as my overarching research design framework and did not attempt to translate one type of knowledge or data into another, but instead held them side by side in order that the productive tension between the two approaches, outcome and contextual, to examining vulnerability, may offer something new and insightful about inequality and vulnerability, as well as aid in overcoming the limitations of each approach that I mentioned. Turning now to the study site of the Georgia coast. Georgia's coast is about 160 kilometers long as the crow flies, with the Savannah River on the north dividing it from South Carolina, and the St. Mary's River on the south dividing it from Florida. Within this coastal zone, there are about 140,000 hectares of tidal wetlands, which comprise about a third of all that found on the eastern seaboard in the U.S. These tidal wetlands consist of freshwater, brackish water, and saltwater marshes, as well as tidal cypress swamps, which are all represented on this map by the area in green. Life in and around this tidal wetland, again, is driven by the large tidal ebb and flow of 2 meters. As for Georgia's socio-demographic characteristics, racial and ethnic minorities comprise approximately 44% of Georgia's coastal population. It also has double-digit percentages of people in poverty or with low educational attainment, meaning below 12th grade, with the population density varying from high-density urban to low-density rural areas, as you can see in this dot density map where one dot represents 100 people. Broadly, my dissertation asked, how can we combine quantitative and qualitative measures of vulnerability to produce more robust and more comprehensive analyses of vulnerability to sea level rise? In order to rigorously engage with this broader question, I broke this down into 3 smaller questions. The first focusing on quantitative outcome modeling, the second on qualitative contextual approaches, and the third on comparing the 2 approaches. For the moment, let's focus on the first question, which asks, who do quantitative models indicate as at risk to sea level rise in coastal Georgia? To answer this question, I first calculated 3 scenarios for sea level rise out to the year 2050, calling them fast, medium, and slow for simplicity, indicated here on the chart by the red, orange, and yellow curves, respectively. These forecasts are locally adjusted for Georgia's coast and are based on the 2014 National Climate Assessment. The range is from approximately 0.21 meters for the yellow curve up to 0.63 meters for the red curve, out to the year 2050. I also projected theoretical indicators of social vulnerability, as has been defined by other scholars, for coastal Georgia's population. This included projecting race and ethnicity, along with total counts for people in poverty or with an educational attainment less than 12th grade, out to 2050. I also used age as an indicator, but I don't show it here for simplicity. As you see in the chart, the racial and ethnic minority population increases over the analysis window for this region, reaching a majority minority population by 2050. The total number of people in poverty and with low educational attainment goes up as both a total count and a percentage of the total population. The key to this approach is that it doesn't assume a static population, but that its composition and characteristics will change over time as seas rise. So it brings together projections of socio-demographic characteristics of a region along with projections of inundation. I combine the sea level rise forecast with the population projections to assess risk in 2050, with risk being defined in this case as social vulnerability times physical exposure. The population that is projected to be at risk for the Georgia coast ranges from approximately 3,500 people to 11,000 people, more than twice previous estimates that are based on 2010 census data counts. The results for risk are shown on the map here for the fast sea level rise scenario as color-coded US Census tracts using a bivariate plot. The different levels of social vulnerability are relative to each other, being based on a half standard deviation from the group mean for all coastal Georgia census tracts. And the same tiered classification system is used for assessing relative levels of inundation exposure of census tracts, and that's on the y-axis, the different shades of blue on the left. The number 11,000 in this case is based on the possible exposure of people living in tracts with elevated levels of social vulnerability. In other words, any of the three shades in the far right column. Switching gears from the outcome vulnerability study to the contextual study for my second research question, I asked, what is the role of race in shaping vulnerability to sea level rise in coastal Georgia? To investigate this question, I compared two different barrier island communities. Regarding rising seas, both of these islands, Tybee and Sapelo, are extremely exposed, with more than half of both islands having an elevation of within 2 meters of current mean higher high water, indicated by all this area shaded in blue here on the maps. As you can see on the right map, the Hog Hammock community, outlined in yellow, is very exposed to rising seas, being on average about 1 meter above current high water. This is the only private residence community on Sapelo and where I conducted my fieldwork. While Tybee is the smaller of the two islands in terms of size, it has a much larger population of about 3,000 residents, being much more urbanized, located near Savannah, Georgia. Sapelo, on the other hand, is a much more rural setting with a population of about 65 full-time residents. Tybee is largely a tourist-driven economy and has turned into a retirement community that was formerly a blue-collar worker bedroom community, whereas Sapelo is mostly owned by the state, has a wildlife management area, and 2 long-term research programs. More importantly for my research question concerning social difference, and particularly race, is that the racial histories of these islands are very different. Tybee residents have been and still are primarily white people, while Sapelo's residents are mostly African Americans who call themselves saltwater Geechee, which is part of the greater Gullah Geechee nation or cultural breed, who are descendants of Sea Island slaves, the Sea Islands being a region of barrier islands that extend from northern Florida into southern North Carolina. In short then, these are communities with significantly different histories of racial politics. To investigate the role of race in shaping vulnerability, I spent a total of 9 months on the Georgia coast, 3 on Tybee Island and 6 on Sapelo Island. During this time, I interviewed 40 residents, held 1 workshop on Sapelo Island, and participated in 39 other events, including church services, public meetings, environmental group meetings, and even dragging a net with locals to catch fish, as well as playing cards at the bar. During that time, I identified 4 barriers to engagement with Sapelo Island's Hog Hammock community, which I argue that these barriers are bolstered by both colorblind and structural racism. Structural racism theorizing that racism works in much more subtle and nefarious ways through social and cultural institutions rather than just through overt or explicit acts of violence. Colorblind racism theory suggests that people tend not to see race as the factor causing racial inequality, but instead attribute observed inequalities to other factors such as class. Both of these theories are much more complex than what I've just stated, and I'd be happy to discuss them in more detail in the Q&A. The first barrier to engagement is what I'm calling a colorblind problem definition, by which I mean an overemphasis on sea level rise vulnerability as just an inundation exposure problem, which occurs often in coastal Georgia's research community of practice looking at sea level rise. This has led to overlooking many crucial questions of how uneven vulnerability will play out across social difference, more than across difference in inundation exposure levels. Second is worry capital allocation, where worry capital is related to having a limited amount of expendable worry. And worry capital allocation is an analytical concept that I'm using for examining how locally marginalized groups of people necessarily navigate and manage hegemonic structural relations of power in the face of a changing climate. So in the case of Hog Hammock, many residents were dealing with the issues of land loss, limited employment, and concerns over loss of cultural identity, not climate change hazards such as sea level rise. It was directly stated to me on a few occasions that there's racial injustice occurring on the island, which, as it was pointed out, are exhibited mostly through a lack of employment opportunities to the Gullah Geechee living on Sapelo, as well as higher property taxes being imposed on the land in Hog Hammock. A third barrier to engagement concerns divergent knowledge discourses that are a product of scientific versus local ways of seeing and talking about the problem of sea level rise and climate change. This difference is exacerbated, however, by the limited number of African Americans in science more generally and the environmental movement more broadly, which is due to a whole list of reasons I really don't have time to go into right now, but which are explained by theory on colorblind and structural racisms, as well as many of the case studies that have investigated these theoretical concepts. The final barrier to engagement that I outline is related to strained historical relations between Sapelo's Geechee community and outsiders, including journalists, scientists, and new property owners, which are due to racial inequalities and sentiments of racial injustice that were expressed by Geechee people during interviews. I want to turn now to thinking about how these two approaches that I covered compare when investigating vulnerability to sea level rise. Specifically, I asked, how do contextual inquiries articulate with outcome models and examinations of vulnerability to sea level rise? It's challenging to make these different approaches commensurate or capable of being co-analyzed, yet when the results of each are examined together, a more comprehensive and robust picture emerges that demonstrates both how and why coastal Georgia residents will experience uneven vulnerability. The outcome modeling approach, with its predictive power, projected a demographic shift to a population with higher incidence of the social characteristics that are theorized to indicate vulnerability. These included a greater proportion of the population having a minority status, being in poverty, having low educational attainment, or being older aged, and consequently, the model predicted a greater population who will be at risk to sea level rise by mid-century. The contextual study grounded the abstract disembodiment of race that occurred in the modeling process. It placed race back in the landscape as a thing that bears material consequence due to racism that leads to racial inequality. A racial inequality that affects the potential for mitigating vulnerability and improving adaptation planning in underrepresented communities. It revealed the narratives that explain the potential for the coast to become more affluent and white due to natural amenity migration, which, as expressed in many of the interviews I held, may lead to cultural displacement of the saltwater Geechee people on Sapelo. So before moving to a few conclusions, I want to briefly review two examples of the interplay and reflexivity that occurred between the GIS-based outcome approach and the contextual study. First, as part of my self-immersion in the landscape, I explored much of the coastal county of McIntosh by bicycle in 2013. What I saw was a number of abandoned developments like the one you see here in the photo that were located along the shoreline of McIntosh County. The abandonment of this site and many of the others is likely due to the economic recession in 2008, but importantly, it suggests that the predictions of populations are possibly overestimates, as the predictions of the populations that I projected out to 2050 are based on the change that occurred between 2000 and 2010. And so we may see a decline in that actual rate of growth. And then secondly, during interviews and conversations, Saplos Geechee people expressed that their greatest concern was the loss of land in their community to outsiders and the associated loss of culture that would come from their identity as saltwater Geechee. Using GIS as an exploratory visualization tool, a common practice in both traditional and qualitative GIS, I was able to visualize land ownership categories as either Geechee-owned, marked in black, state-owned, either outright as marked by beige yellow, or through the Sapelo Island Heritage Authority, marked as dark gray, the Heritage Authority being a joint institution comprised of Geechee residents and state staff members, as well as non-traditionally owned, marked by light gray. These are the outsiders that have moved in. It's not dark gray, it's white. I was able to take these different statuses for parcel ownership as they exist now and overlay them with sea level rise inundation modeling that I run during the risk assessment. This gave context to the modeling process as it laid bare the possibility that if sea level rise takes the fast scenario route, then when seas have risen enough to regularly flood Hog Hammock by mid-century, indicated by all the area in blue now, most Geechee people may have become displaced, a concern that was expressed during interviews that the community would become all white people just in the next few decades. And by the year 2100, Hog Hammock will likely not be inhabitable by people, as it will have all been inundated completely with 6+ feet of sea level rise. Land losses by Saplos Geechee people to non-Geechee people is more of an imminent threat, which partially explains why they are choosing to allocate effort and resources, such as worry capital, to this and not to future sea level rise, even though it's clearly an imminent threat if there's a fast route. Turning to 4 conclusions from this work now. The first is that model-based examinations of race as an indicator of vulnerability are devoid of interpretive power without critical race theory and on-the-ground empirics for analyzing how local race relations affect power inequality and access to resources as they regard vulnerability to sea level rise. Second, investigating the vulnerability to sea level rise of a culture and or a place through interpretive analysis of its stories and narrative histories is strengthened, I argue, by modeled projections of both sea level rise inundation and population change. Third, assessments of vulnerability and or risk to sea level rise require agility. In other words, an open mind and avoidance of the politics of defensiveness and dismissal in order to apply the appropriate scale, epistemological framing, and methods for analysis. And fourth and finally, dissertations are projects, but I would argue that an integrative dissertation is a process, one that is an entangled web of many projects that reveals both the complexity of seeing an issue through multiple lenses, as well as the incommensurate ways of knowing it. I'll leave you with this image taken by Jacob Schalick of UGA's Marine Institute last October during the extreme high tide event. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks for coming again.
Who else is there?
It's a lot for 9 a.m., eh?
I was wondering about that high tide event. What caused it? Like why? So it's above the mean high tide, so there are some that are that high.
So, right. So this is something Matt Hauer and I have talked about when we're developing this idea that most assessments, we moved from looking at mean sea level to looking at mean higher high water as the inundation extent. But it's mean higher high water, right? So there's a range around that, and there's a probability that it'd be above that. And we're trying to develop a way to look at the potential population that would be affected, in those instances where it goes over mean higher high water in a probability way. This was caused by, a combination of things, right? At sea level rise over the past century and a half due to greenhouse gas emissions. This particular case, northeast winds had a whole lot to do with it being like a half foot higher than they had predicted that day. And everyone down there knows that. They can tell you, they're like, if that wind's blowing from the northeast, you better watch out because the water's coming, right? And I mean, I would say those are the two major contributing factors, but then there are probably other smaller weather contributing factors that I can't speak to.
Well, wasn't there also on that particular day a particularly the moon phase too?
Yeah, so what's it called? It's what they call king tides in Australia, and we've come to start calling them that here in the U.S. It has to do with the alignment of the moon and the sun at a particular time of year. It happens twice a year. I think it's January and October, and I forget the like, I guess the astronomical term you use, but it has to do with the moon being at perigee, right? So it's like a regular high tide, but the moon's, it's like when the moon in its non-circular orbit is actually closest to the Earth and lined up with the sun perfectly, so that everything is just in perfect order to make it really high. And so that's always been the case, but if you add a foot of sea level rise like we've seen in Georgia, and the northeast winds, this starts to happen because they built all that. Well, that was just built like 10 years ago. Those are the dorms. They built them up on purpose, but I don't know if you build them up high enough. It didn't go into the building at least, just to the base of it.
Is that lower than the plantation, the old part, the old dorms? What did they look like?
Yeah, that's lower. Yeah, so I mean, this is the Tidal Creek. There's a Tidal Creek that runs right here, a ditch. It's not a creek. I think it was dug out by Reynolds.
So it wasn't flooded over by the pond?
It wasn't. It was flooded by the boat dock behind the powerhouse. All that was, it was flooded up to the back door of the powerhouse and all around there. The reason these images I'm showing, I was in my car when this was happening, driving to the coast, because it was supposed to be the lower of the 2 days of tide. And because of the winds, it ended up being the higher tide. So I had to get people to send me photos. Yeah, Gary.
So I thought this was really interesting, nuanced, like really informative. I think my question for you, the short version is kind of a so what kind of question. The longer version is, okay, here's this kind of, you use these multiple methods and you develop, like there's one method kind of points this way, another method points this way. We need to kind of look at them together and get this really kind of sophisticated understanding. But if we're thinking about like, so for these communities that are on these islands that are thinking about how to plan for the future, what's the kind of takeaway for them in terms of, in essence, kind of what's your research do, and what do you think the implications are for actual policymakers and community members as they try to negotiate kind of near and short term plans?
Part of what I'm trying to do, particularly in Georgia, and I'm wary to, as I pointed out, one of the limitations of contextual studies is the ability to generalize to this kind of broader theoretical concept, right? I mean,
yeah, no, you can tell stories, right? And stories have power.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't do something with it. So I've been working on sea level rise on the Georgia coast since about 2008, and have been involved in 4 or 5 different projects, either directly as someone presenting to county staff and whatnot on the coast, or peripherally as someone who is just, talking to somebody over lunch about the project they were working on. And what's constantly missed to me is this idea that social difference has an importance, right? That it matters a lot. And there's this real desire, I would argue, because of like the weight of science and climate change, right? And the scientific endeavor of climate change, the power of science and climate change, to focus on that and like, let's like make our inundation model way better. So there's millions of dollars of grant money going towards all this, when really what we're talking about is sea level rise is going to affect people's livelihoods, right? So I mean, I slip back and forth in this as looking at it as a livelihoods thing versus like I'm still looking at exposure modeling, like whose property is going to be flooded, like the hog hemming map, right? It's still an interesting thing. And so I'm not saying that that's not valuable. What I'm trying to do with my work is say, hey, we also have to think about how there's this underrepresented community who's not part of the greater scientific community, who's not part of the environmental movement, who has a voice and who has their own knowledge and language for talking about it. We have to engage with that in a particular way. And much how, like, I'm wary to say this with Richard in the room, but much how, like, the EPA, I forget what they're called, in Canada has kind of absorbed some of the politics of indigenous people to use indigenous knowledge. But we have to take care not to do it in the way that his work has, said, not to just go out and be like, look, we put environmental justice into EPA programming, so it's all okay. It's just trying to say that we need more attention on it. So in terms of how that affects policy, I think more research and policy needs to be directed at underrepresented communities.
Yeah, and I'm hearing more like participatory as well, like you need to incorporate.
For sure.
Folks.
Yeah. I mean, as complicated as that is, and it's one of those things where like you see all these holes in both your research and your argument, and to fill them are super challenging as an individual who's not a team of people. Thanks for the question. It's a good one, and something I still haven't.
Yeah, it's always.
Yeah, Kate.
Do you see any differences in terms of how race influenced ways communities are adapting to climate change?
Not specifically, other than one of the arguments that I make in the longer version of this that these guys all have read now out, is that one of the arguments I make is that it's not that Tybee Island has a sea level, so I didn't mention this, Tybee Island has a sea level rise adaptation plan. It took a few years. They worked with Georgia Sea Grant and the Colorblind Institute to develop this plan. It's this really long, elaborate plan about how to adapt to it. Looks at economic cost-benefit analysis, what they can do to like raise infrastructure, what properties might be most hit. And Sapelo doesn't. And I can't definitively say that Tybee has one and Sapelo doesn't because of any particular reason, it being racial or not. My argument is really that Tybee is far more likely to have one, not just because of being more affluent or being primarily an urban area, but because most of the people there are white. And so in my interviews, something I didn't really talk about is when I had interviews with, so I should mention, because this came up in the job talk I had recently, that I didn't elaborate on who I interviewed. I've officially interviewed 10 African Americans and 30 people who were white. I interacted with 22 African Americans, aside from those 10 that I interviewed, on this conversation in this topic in a more informal setting. I think the social networks that develop in the environmental movement and science more generally led to, at least this is my kind of hypothesis about this, that people on Tybee talk to me in the same language of climate change science, and I read science in a lot of the same journals, and those were their references for news. Whereas on Sapelo, it was hard to even like have a conversation about climate change or sea level rise. It had to be about flooding and environmental change, right? Like about the trees growing on the island. It had to be much more disconnected from that climate change science narrative. I forget what your original question was. But
Adaptation.
yeah, so, I mean, I think, so people were, I think in terms of that broader level adaptation, but in terms of how people were actually doing it, I mean, no. It was pretty similar, people just doing little things. I mean, one guy was digging a ditch and burying a hole between two tidal creeks, like a pipe. So that if it flooded, he could uncap the pipe, and then instead of it flooding his drive, it would go into the pipe and go out to the other tidal creek, or at least fill up the pipe. Which is a lot like what Tybee was doing on a different scale with their tidal gates that were one way. Yeah, Brian?
So forgive me if I mischaracterized something you said already, but it seemed to me that you were saying, like in the case of Hog Hammock, that the people there are more worried about outsiders coming in and buying property, and what that does to the local community. But then you show the map of how the flooding will happen, and it's it's a significant thing that's going to affect the community in the near term. It seems interesting to me that in a case like that, you have the two forces sort of from two different sides, right? You have the sea coming in, and you have outsiders coming in. And that's an extreme example, but you showed that cove community where there's been a plan to invest by somebody in housing development. And it seems interesting to me, I was just struck listening to that there's an interaction between what you as a climate change scientist do, how aggressive you are in letting people know how bad sea level rise will be.
Yeah.
And that outside investment, right? At some point, people are going to realize, oh yeah, we can't invest in a place on the ridge, right, on 99 out by the ferry dock.
Yeah.
it's only going to be there for 20, 30 years. Like, that's a bad investment.
Right.
So you have these forces that you sort of highlighted in the two different ways of looking at this, that there might be more poverty on the coast if you look at it one way, there might be more investment. You know, there's a natural tendency for there to be investment by wealthier people on the coast too, but it seems like that second thing might dry up. The more aggressive we are about letting people know
Sure.
that it's a problem, and the more insurance companies
So-
realize that that's a bad thing. So I don't have a question.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I think about that a lot, actually. So Richard was my hired research assistant at the workshop on Saplo, and he was my note taker. And you know, in showing those maps to people, a couple of things came out of that. Like during the workshop, one of the key Geechee people in the community, when I was like, "What do you guys think this would do to property value?" and their response was, "It'll cut it the hell out," right? Not verbatim. And I think there's a hope that happens in this particular community, because some of the people that I talk to would rather see the community go away or be given to the state than be sold to outsiders. So there's that racial politics going on, and it's fully racially charged in all the conversations. So there's this aspect of being aggressive that's good, because it's like we don't need to develop these areas so they can be transgression zones, especially in the case of the code where it wasn't developed, right? But there's this aspect that's, it's so complicated, because some people want the property value to go down so no one keeps selling it to outsiders. For me to show that map, I'm like, am I going to devalue your property and, like, as a white academic researcher, cause people to not be interested and have your $150,000 a quarter acre, which is what it's going for right now, drop?
Exactly right.
So there's this sensitivity, because there was a guy who had just bought property who was also at the workshop, and I saw him a few days later up at the chocolate plantation. We were both taking tours of the island, we were showing different people around. And he was like, "So you did a really good job of knocking our property value back the other night. Like, I'm a little bit worried now." You know, so like it created waves, and people were apparently talking about it for a couple of weeks after.
And you can imagine if you're a McIntosh County Commissioner or whatever, that's the last thing you want to hear somebody talking about.
Yeah. You want the tax rates, right?
Without hearing about it first, right?
Yeah.
Like filtering that.
Yeah. Sort of answers your non-question.
That was good.
Any other thoughts, questions? I can talk all day. I wrote so many pages.
Plenty more talking than talking.
Right, that's all great. I thought it was good. We're done. Right?
Well, thank you all for coming.
Yeah.